Welcome, everybody. I hope you're having a great day. It's been a wonderful expo going on out here, and we're happy that you came here today because it shows how much interest you have in learning about the weather and the hurricane season coming up, and we are in it. We already have one storm that has been named Arlene out there in the Gulf of Mexico. Looks like it's steering to the south, heading towards Cuba, but we won't have any effects from that. That's looking pretty good as far as that's concerned, but we still have a long season to go. And the picture behind me, what you can remember, is this is a lot of the video that you've probably seen already on television from Ian just the previous year. And they're still cleaning up. There's a lot of FEMA trailers still out there, a lot of line crews working and power companies dealing with all the cleanup and construction crews. The beaches are still trying to be cleaned up, as well as also the islands that had to get access to from the bridges being washed out. So this was a major storm and a major impact for Florida. And that's why we want to make sure you're aware of what to do if we have something that affects us. Now, our side of the state, we haven't had as many as some areas may have had, but many people do remember other storms, from Wilma to Andrew to, these names may ring some truth to you. Remember Matthew. There's a lot of storms that can occur, and they can cross our area. So we just want to make sure that you are prepared and you know what to do. And it's not about fear. I keep telling people it's not to scare anybody. It's more just to be aware. And if you know where you live and where you need to be, if there is an evacuation called, do you have flooding potential in your neighborhood? Do you have flood insurance? Do you have all of these things that are very important if you do have a storm? A lot of folks have just moved. How many people have just recently moved here or moved here from somewhere else? They're not Florida natives. You're from somewhere else. You came from New Jersey, New York, Michigan. I came from Michigan. I was in Baltimore before here. So, I had to kind of pick up on, where I live. I see it's really, you see the hurricane evacuation routes as Hurricane Preparedness Week. And, just you need to have knowledge. That's what's important. So as you can see here, Hurricane Ian drone video, we are just showing what was back there. This is just going back here. You could see the radar image of the landfall. And this was on September 28th last year. You can see the center of that eye moving on shore. Lots of winds of 150 mile an hour measured, Category 4 storm. Now, one of the things I want to draw attention to, we talk about categories. That's the Sanford-Simpson scale from Cat 1 to Cat 5. I want you to not really focus on the categories so much. When we're talking, we'll say something about it, talking about the winds, but it's really the rainfall, storm surge, and flooding you need to be alert about. That's what you focus on, not so much the wind. Winds are going to knock over some, break some trees, take some power lines down. It's the flooding. If you live in a coastal area or area that's prone to flooding, pay attention. I don't care what station you're watching. If it's us, I hope it's us. But it's us. If it's us, that's not a commercial. I'm telling you, just make sure you pay attention to what the storm surge or the flooding is in your area, because that is the number one killer. It's not the wind, it's the flooding. And people drowned because they are caught in an area. Oh, I'm not leaving. I've been through so many storms. Oh, I went through this one. I went through that one. Every storm is different. They are not the same. Every one of them have something different involved. So you can't say, well, I went through this. It wasn't so bad. Oh, it's just a tropical storm. It isn't even a category yet. It could be a tropical depression that sits over your neighborhood for 3 days and rains, and it becomes the most devastating flooding event in your area. And that's true. So we just want you to be aware of the potential impacts in your area, and flooding is one of the things we want you to pay attention to. Peak wind gusts of this storm, as you can see from looking back, we had Cape Coral 140 mile an hour winds. Now we're talking about winds here. Punta Gorda 124. You get down to Venice looking at 104. Okeechobee City 74. St. Lucie looking at 57. So the vast wideness of this storm, remember these storms stretch across sometimes the entire state. So even though it comes on the western edge of the state, it could affect you based on wind or rain or tornadoes. Remember, these storms have outer bands, and those bands have a lot of spinning vorticities in them, so they can quickly spin up a tornado, and it touches down tornado warning within just a few seconds. So that's part of the other danger that we have with these storms. So just because it might be the eye coming on over some other part over near Tampa, it could spin off a tornado over in Okeechobee. And you're saying, oh, the eye's over there. We have some sun, and then there's cloud and rain. Then the sun came back out. But then the next band that came through had a tornado warning. That's why you have to stay alert and don't go to the we're going to the grocery store. No, stay at home and pay attention to what's going on. So here's a look at the hurricane season from last year. And on one thing interesting, you can see we had 3 storms that crossed right over southeast Florida. and parts of them affecting our area. So we had Ian, and then we had Nicole, and then you also had Alex, Hermine. We had all these storms out here, and then you can see some of the tracks that did move up the Atlantic, kind of just spun around out in the Atlantic, going into the Caribbean. So there's a lot of potential formation locations, and as we go through the season, it really starts picking up. So we start seeing activity really start ramping up as we get to late July, but more August, September, October, and November, into November. So that is something that you want to make sure you're aware of. Hurricane Nicole, once again, we're looking at the landfall Nicole back on November 12th, and this was 3 a.m., and we could see how that came in up to the north. How many of you guys remember this? Who stuck around? Who were around for this? Had the rain, you had the wind. There was some erosion, beach erosion, some flooding. It wasn't horrible, but still there was a storm that we had to deal with. Winds at 75 miles an hour, Category 1, but still there was flooding, there was some damage. But once again, this storm is different than another storm. Every one of them, depending on how they travel, either up the coast, a direct landfall, or did it rain 3 days before, a bunch of rain? So that storm could create a lot of flooding. So there's a lot of parameters that go into play. When we say flood warning and you're a flash flood warning, that means it's flooding and it's happening right now. Do not drive in that. Who remembers this storm? Can you name it? Anybody? Hand up. Dorian. This storm was very scary. I'll never forget when I was watching this storm, and the path was still uncertain. 100% we didn't know. It had a tending to turn to the right, and you look at the direction, the worst part of this storm, well, all of it is the worst part, really. This is a bear of a storm. But you could see just sitting over Grand Bahama Island, just a buzzsaw, and sat there for a full day, 24 hours of just horrible, horrible, horrible winds. And we're talking about a Category 5 storm that was moving across this island. And remember, that's a not very tall island, very flat island. They had 25-foot storm surge in some areas that was going across this, and it was coming towards West Palm Beach, moving up towards Martin County. We're thinking, Port St. could it affect this? But it made that right turn. Thank goodness to the weather parameters that were also steering this. Because we don't just look at the ocean. You have to look at what's ahead of it. Is there a cold front? Is there a high pressure blocking it, not allowing it to move forward? There's a lot that goes into forecasting for these storms, but this was a scary one. I don't forget it. As we look at this numbers for this year, named storms. So you see CSU in the middle is Colorado State University. They come out with a forecast earlier on. I don't know, there's no hurricanes in Colorado, but they like them. So they like to put them out. So here you go. Their forecast came out a month ago. You're looking at 13 named storms. That means the storm has become a tropical depression, a tropical storm, and becomes a named storm. We have 13 storms named, 6 of which would be hurricanes out of those 13, and their forecast was 2 becoming major, means Category 3 or greater. You look at NOAA's forecast, it's saying pretty much the same thing, but it's saying in this El Nino year, where the Atlantic should have lesser amounts of storm, and we would see a warmer Pacific, but we still have to see how that plays out because the Atlantic's still warm. Those sea surface temperatures are very warm out there. We have a lot of available moisture with these storms at work. How are those steering winds working coming off the west coast of Africa, through the Caribbean, down in the Gulf? Well, what's happening? They're giving it 12 to 17 named storms, 5 to 9 of which can become hurricanes. So you put 6 in the middle of that, kind of the same forecast, but yet this is a little higher from NOAA. Major hurricanes from 1 to 4. They're pegging it at 2. So could we get about 2 to 3 if you give it an average? Possibly. That become major, and that means a Category 3 or greater. Now, remember I said categories are talking about winds, but remember, a tropical storm can do just as much damage and create as many deaths with someone being swept away, a family being swept away in a van. They went to go travel out in a storm, and yet they get swept away with the road being washed out, and there's 6 people gone. So that's the reality. We have to face that, and I hate hearing that. It breaks my heart. Every time we hear about a death that's caused by a storm, when people could be safe at home or go to another location from a flooded area, and some people just don't know their areas. They're new, or they just don't really take it serious. So we really ask you, really take it serious about these storms. Atlantic hurricane season outlook. Once again, this is the looking at 40% named storms. We're looking at hurricanes 5 to 9. Major hurricanes, it's about 30% above normal. And then we're seeing near normal or below normal, the seasonal probability. So the probability of seeing these storms forming and the strength of what they would be. But there will be a pretty good chance we will get one or two that are major. That ocean's really warm, and one of the things as forecasters that we are looking at that's very challenging is rapid intensification. So with the ocean and the Gulf being above normal temperature-wise, we're seeing storms not take 4 days to get to Cat 4 or 5. We're seeing 24 hours to 48 hours. What? That's like, wow, you finished a whole box of cereal in a morning eat. That's pretty much what it is. It's like, wow, it didn't take a week or 2 weeks. It took just 1 day. You know, it's just amazing how these things just form. National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration Hurricane Outlook. High potential for El Nino, which I mentioned. It can suppress hurricane activity above normal West African monsoon season, produces African easterly waves, warm than normal sea surface temperatures in Atlantic and Caribbean, creates more energy and fuel for the storm. So that's some of the parameters we're looking at going into the forecasting. But like I said, the Atlantic is warm and the trade winds aren't 100% like aligning. Looking at sea temperature anomalies, you see it's usually during the El Nino season off the coast of South America, you see a much above average sea surface temperatures as you see this upwelling that goes on that happens out there. It's not as much upwelling with the cooler waters rising to the surface. You have the surface temperatures staying above normal, and what we were seeing out there is it is much above normal, but at the same time, when we see that, we get more storms, less wind shear off the west coast of Mexico, less storms, more wind shear, and that's what we generally get. You know, we're seeing that a little bit with Arlene out there. That's the forecast. We saw the storm traveling south in the Gulf right now, and it's running into wind shear. So wind shear is something that kind of tears apart the storms, and that's what we're seeing. And we see warm and wet conditions out in the Pacific. So with that, I'm going to pitch it over to meteorologist Michael Ehrenberg to continue on about the hurricane activity. Mike?
Okay, thanks everybody for joining, and thanks for Vitas for doing the first part of the presentation. We got the little clicker here. So like Vitas was talking about, we've got basically El Nino going on across the Pacific. You get warm, wet conditions across the eastern Pacific. Why does that matter for us? Well, what happens is you get a lot of storms in the Pacific, and across the eastern sections of the Atlantic, the western Atlantic, you do get a lot of wind shear, that twisting and turning of winds with height, and that can knock down storms and prevent storms from developing or weakening some storms. So let's hope that happens a lot during the season. Here are the names. Of course, Arlene was just born a little more than 24 hours ago. Arlene's the first named storm of the season, but as of the last check late this morning, it's been downgraded to Tropical Depression Arlene. Unfortunately, that's going to continue to go south-southeast and just kind of get ripped apart there, mostly due to dry air and also a lot of wind shear in excess of 40 knots. So good news with that. We're just getting a little bit of indirect moisture from that system. Now, the Hurricane Center several years ago, instead of going to the Greek alphabet, I remember a few years ago, it's like alpha, beta, gamma. It's like, we can't keep track of those names. They just decided to go to one uniform secondary hurricane name list. Okay, so Adria, Braylon, Caridad, and on down. Now, rarely do we go to the secondary name lists. You have to get through all 21 letters, not 26. Keep in mind, there isn't a storm for every letter of the alphabet, and that's because, you know, there aren't a lot of names, you know, with X, Y, and Z, and Q, and things like that, so they don't have those names. But we get a secondary hurricane list if we get a very busy hurricane season. This is an interesting graphic. It shows you the probability of a landfall odd of one or more events, which is tropical storm or higher, within 50 miles of Florida. The 2023 odds are 87%. That doesn't mean here at Port St. Lucie. It just means anywhere near Florida, there's a 87% chance of a named storm getting within 50 miles of the coast. A major hurricane, 30% chance, okay? Now here in Indian River in St. Lucie County, you can see the named storm impacts a 36% possibility. Normally, that's climatology, 38% chance. So a 38% chance that right where you're sitting now, there'll be a named storm that passes within 50 miles. Let's hope if we're in that, if we do get it, that it's 50 miles offshore and we're on the weaker side and maybe it's a storm and it wouldn't really be a big deal. Wishful thinking, right? Palm Beach County, a little higher probability at 44%. For getting a named storm within 50 miles of the area. This graphic is interesting. It shows how often a hurricane is going to return to where you are. And this is a 30-year average. The average years between hurricane landfall. And right up here, you can see on the Treasure Coast, it's about 8 years. So let's go back. When did we have one last? We had, of course, just last year, we had, it was Nicole, but that was offshore, all right? But that was a hurricane. So as you probably know, if you've been here any length of time, that the hurricane season usually starts off rather slow in June and July, and then we see a peak in September. So we all get kind of crazy from mid-August to mid-October. For years, I've often said to myself, I am not going to schedule a vacation from mid-August to mid-October, because more than likely, I'm going to be called back, and I have been called back from vacations in years past. So you do your best to kind of just be around the area during that time. In June, we typically look in the area of the Gulf or off the southeast coast or in the northwest Caribbean for systems to develop. And that's because the water temperatures in this area are warm enough. Further east out towards Africa, the waters aren't quite warm enough to support the development of tropical system. You need water temperatures in the low 80s or higher. We go into August and we start seeing the development more out there towards the central sections of the Caribbean and the Atlantic, and by the time we get to the end of the hurricane season, then we go back to the Caribbean or Gulf or off the southeast coast of the U.S. So things kind of shift from where it is now to the African coast, the Cape Verde hurricane season in August and September, and then back into this area where the waters continue to stay warm enough to support development during the tail end of the hurricane season. So know your evacuation zones. If you're in an evacuation zone for a particular storm, you do need to evacuate. But you notice it's a very narrow area. All but Hutchinson Island is Zone A. That's a hurricane Category 1. Zone B, higher. So here's where we are. We're not in an evacuation zone here, just along the Intracoastal Waterway. All right. They always say if you're not in an evacuation zone, you don't have to evacuate. You just got to make sure that you prepare and you've got that hurricane supply checklist ready to go. There's a look at Martin County, if you're from Martin County. It's interesting that along the rivers and canals, you can be well inland from the ocean, like off the St. Lucie River, way down south and west, out there towards the Turnpike and 95, you'd have to evacuate. Same thing down here off of Jupiter Island. There's a lot of low-lying areas, and you would have to evacuate almost as far west as 95 if you live on a tributary or a canal there. Okay, this is just a little graphic of what you need to do when you, and hurricane's coming. 5 to 7 days out, put your hurricane kit together. 3 to 5 days out, if you're in the cone, activate your plan, prepare your property. This is when you put your shutters up. And then evacuate from the coast if ordered if you're within days 1 through 3 of the storm. So what about preparedness? So this is a hurricane preparedness kit that you see here. Okay, and for those of you that are new, this is always a good thing to know. Right now, you can prepare for at least a week, get non-perishable foods. We're talking like canned goods, tuna, soup, SpaghettiOs, whatever you have. 3 gallons of water per person per day with pets. That can be just 1 gallon. Medicine, flashlights, gas, important papers and games. That stuff can all be kind of, you can do a lot of this stuff now before a storm threatens. So the more you prepare ahead of time, the safer I think you'll feel. The more you prepare and get ready, when a storm comes, a hurricane watch warning goes up, you won't be as nervous or you won't be as anxious, okay? Here's another checklist here. Non-perishable foods, fill prescriptions, and take out cash from the ATM. That kind of stuff you'd want to do within several days. Like if we start getting into the cone, then obviously you can fill your prescriptions, get cash out in case the electricity goes out and you can't use your credit or debit card anywhere. A battery-powered LED lights and a no-weather radio, solar-powered battery portable chargers, so you can make sure you're all ready with that. These are things you can do now here in June. Trim the trees around your home. Purchase plywood, steel, and aluminum panels. That kind of goes along with the lines of shutters. More and more nowadays, especially if you're in a newer house, you've got those accordions. They're so nice you can kind of close them up. You don't have to lumber around with those big panels. Hurricane impact windows are great. Of course, they're very costly. Hopefully, as we go through the future, they'll be coming down in price and more of us can get those because you won't have to do anything. Secure your doors or garage. Help collecting supplies, assist with shutters, check on each other. One thing we want to talk about before we wrap it up is basically climate change and how it impacts hurricanes. That's been in the news a lot over the last few days. And we did a little story for a hurricane special last year. I want to run this for you guys. It runs about a few minutes. So let's see if we can't get this playing here.
Well, hurricane season officially starts in 2 weeks on June 1st. The trend continues to be higher than average activity, and some of the storms in recent years have been even more powerful.
Our storm track meteorologist Michael Ehrenberg is here to answer the questions. Is it really true? What's happening to make those storms more powerful?
In the last 4 decades, human-caused warming due to increased carbon dioxide emissions has increased the likelihood of a hurricane developing into a major hurricane, Category 3 or higher, by about 8% per decade.
As we add more of that heat-trapping gas, it in turn traps heat. That plays out in a lot of different ways.
Bernadette Plocke is the director of Climate Central's Climate Matters program. She works with meteorologists from across the country, collaborating and sharing data on the connection between climate change and weather. Bernadette and I are talking about the rapid intensification of storms, like when wind speeds increase 35 miles per hour or more in 24 hours or less. Since 1986, rapid intensification has been on a steady uptick, 4.4 miles per hour per decade. The culprit, warmer ocean temperatures due to the combination of a natural cycle shift and global warming.
We get our fuel for hurricanes and tropical systems in general from the warm water. And with a warming climate, a lot of that heat is going into the ocean. So there's a lot more heat for these storms to tap into. That way, when they form, they explode more quickly.
The most destructive storms are the ones that rapidly intensify right before landfall. Coastal residents misjudge how much time they have to prepare. Hurricanes Harvey, Irma, Maria, and Michael in 2017 and 18 are recent examples of such explosive destruction. The record-breaking 2020 season saw 10 such rapidly intensifying storms. Not only is the ocean temperature increasing at the surface, but also deep underwater. This large reserve of stored heat, or ocean heat content, is abnormally high. Storms can tap into this, giving them a better chance of quickly strengthening. A warming atmosphere can lead to a higher flood risk with hurricanes.
We've got this layer around the earth that is warming. So what it's doing is evaporating more water into that layer. We're seeing more water is available to come down in those storms. So when we get a warming ocean, when we get a warming atmosphere, we get more water in that atmosphere. So it comes down in these bigger buckets.
The latest report from the IPCC forecasts a 10 to 15% increase of average rainfall rates from tropical systems in a 4-degree global warm-up. Climate change has led to rising sea levels due to the melting of global ice sheets and thermal expansion. This leads to the potential for much larger and longer-lasting coastal and inland storm surge. South Florida officials are exploring ways to shore up and strengthen our natural barriers, our dunes and wetlands. And experts like Bernadette say hurricanes will continue to supercharge.
If we don't make changes to our current emissions, then our sea level rise toward the end of the century is really going to accelerate to a point that it'll be hard to adapt to.
Michael Ehrenberg, CBS 12 News.